Right. So we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us today for Attack Surface Management. Find your assets before the attackers do. My name's Courtney, and I run product marketing here at Intruder. I'm going to kick off the session with a snapshot of what we're going to cover today. So, in today's session, we're going to look at why asset discovery is so critical and how attackers discover your attack surface. Andy's going to give us 4 top tips to protect your attack surface, and then we're going to look at some different approaches for managing it all. We'll close out the session with a Q&A with our amazing team. So before we jump into it, just a few housekeeping things. Throughout the webinar, you can drop questions in the live Q&A section in Zoom. If we don't get a chance to answer every question, we'll follow up with you directly after the webinar. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat box in the portal, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. We'll also be sharing a recording of this webinar to everyone who has registered, so look out in your inbox for that after the session. Right, without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our speakers for today. First, we have Joe Haig, our Senior Technical Support Specialist, whom some of you probably have met before. Joe is part of our amazing customer support team. And next, we have Andy Hornegold, our VP of Product, and I'm going to hand you over to Andy so he can give a quick background on himself. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Courtney. Yes, hi everyone. My name's Andy. I'm the VP of Product here at Intruder. As you can see on the screen in front of you right now, so my background is predominantly cybersecurity back in the day in the Big Four. Please don't hold it against me. Then moved into a more boutique firm context, information security, where I ran the assurance team before moving over to FARO Mandiant, as it was back then, now Google Mandiant, where I was the EU Red Team lead, so building out the threat simulation team in the EU for Mandiant. Decided to bring all of that domain knowledge and put it into Intruder to try and help everybody, every single one of our customers, rather than doing it on a one-to-one basis like you do with consulting, try and help as many people as possible in a shorter time frame as possible, and hopefully prevent the attackers from getting into our target audience. So thanks very much for joining me today. So we're going to start off with I suppose the main premise for today, which is companies don't know where their attack surface is. We did a reasonable amount of research on this relatively recently, and we dug into about 3,000 organizations to find assets that belonged to those organizations and track whether or not they were included as part of their vulnerability management process. What we found was that of the visibility that these individuals and these organizations had, they were actually only tracking about 21% of their internet-facing assets. That meant 79% of the assets that they had exposed to the internet weren't falling into their vulnerability management processes. That means approximately 1 in 5 assets are included, and the remaining 4, the extra 80% or so, may have vulnerabilities on them that allow people to get a foothold into those organizations and allow attackers to gain privileges, gain information, and potentially carry out all kinds of malicious activity. This was the research that we did. This was across 3,000 organizations. From this, the insight we've taken away is that it's hard to track the attack surface. But actually, attackers do know where a company's attack surface is. How do we know this? Well, see it most days in the news. You can see the Capita incident that happened relatively recently came from an unsecured AWS bucket. Some of the Microsoft AI researchers exposing 38 terabytes of data, and also cloud misconfigurations causing data breaches. All of this comes from misconfigurations and attack surface not being tracked potentially as effectively as it could be, and where there's a diff between the attackers knowing what's there and what the defenders know what's there is where we start to run into these kinds of problems. One of the bigger ones that hit the news, probably, I believe it was the end of last year, beginning of this, was the Optus breach, and that one caused 10 million customers. I believe the total number of people impacted was about 1/3 of the Australian population, which is huge. With all of that in mind, attackers starting to be able to find attack surface faster than the defenders. You might be mistaken for thinking, well, this kind of only impacts large enterprises who have on-prem estates and they've grown organically over the years. What we've been seeing in research from across the entire security industry is actually those attackers that are starting to gain, I suppose, trying to gain more footholds, are starting to target smaller and medium-sized businesses, not just focusing on those large S&P 500 or the larger organizations. They're actually moving more towards that SMB market. There's a bunch of different reasons that could be, but if you start to think about those larger enterprises contributing larger budgets to cyber defense and trying to prevent these kinds of compromises, it makes more sense for these attackers to shift to the lower hanging fruit, hit those smaller organizations, and then use the information that they have from those smaller organizations to then move to larger organizations. So similar to those kinds of supply chain attacks that we're seeing. Lockbit is the largest ransomware, or sorry, the most impactful ransomware gang out there at the moment, or the most prolific, and they're hitting small and medium-sized businesses 65.9% of the time and 14.6% of the time, respectively. So that's quite a big shift over the last year towards that SMB market. So it isn't just a problem for enterprise, it is a problem for anyone who maintains an internet-facing presence. We've established that it's difficult for defenders potentially to gain visibility on what their attack surface looks like, but it is easy for attackers to find that attack surface. Why? Well, we'll dig into the why now and the how. They have a lot of tooling available to them. There's been a lot of research and a lot of capability development over the years for shining a light on internet-facing assets and a lot of research. So what are attackers looking for? Predominantly, they're looking for IP ranges. They're looking for domains and subdomains that belong to organizations. Source code repositories as well, very useful for mining sensitive information that can facilitate other attack paths or potentially compromising other accounts. They're looking for SaaS systems that are in use and accounts that are used to log into those SaaS systems. Certainly within that smaller and mid-sized business, SaaS has obviously exploded. But if we can gain access to those accounts, then we can start to facilitate potential other movement across the organization or social engineering to try and gain access to other organizations as well. And then cloud assets too. So cloud accounts, sure, the accounts you log into to manage your assets and your infrastructure, but also the nodes and the systems and the workloads that you're spinning up in those cloud environments. So this is what they're looking for. This is what we're going to focus on for today. I briefly mentioned social engineering. We're not going to focus too much on the social engineering approach, and certainly not going to go down the route of the rubber hose approach of extracting information about people's attack surface. We're focusing on what people can do across the internet right now, and the tools that are available to allow attackers to do this sort of thing. So if we take a little bit of an example here, we have a small area that we know where our assets exist. So we have example.com and we have an IP range. The first step in that is, well, let's see what other assets we can find. Let's go for that breadth first approach before we start digging deeper into these assets. So I want to find other domains that belong to this organization. I want to find other IP ranges. Finding those IP ranges is relatively easy, especially if you're an organization that hosts its own IP range. The reason that's easy to gather is because it's public information. You want people to be able to route to your IP ranges. There's not really much point in having an internet routable or an internet addressable IP range if you're not going to allow people to communicate with it. You can check on Hurricane Electric, which is a really well-established service for mining BGP information and that kind of routing information. You can see the kind of routes we're going to expand our example here and focus across all of these examples with Uber, so you can see the kinds of information that we've found about Uber's environment, but also feel free to follow along with me, visit these websites and start doing the searching yourself. You can see registered routes, so that's where these IP addresses and IP subnets are owned by Uber. And then there's also BGP view. So BGP is the protocol that allows the internet to maintain its routes, so it knows who and where to route traffic to those IP ranges. So we can gather a list of IP ranges owned by, for example, Uber Technologies. Cool. We have a bunch of subnets that we can target. With part of that, breadth first search as well. You might be focusing on one organization. Take Uber. Uber has actually acquired a bunch of organizations over its history, and we want to dig into what those organizations are, because if we can compromise an asset that belongs to one of those organizations that Uber has acquired, there's a high likelihood we'll be able to pivot into Uber's environment. So you can use Crunchbase to mine this sort of information. And another place is the newsroom or the press page for the organization that attackers are looking to compromise. So lots of information is published. This is big news, right? You acquire an organization, you want people to know about it. So obviously that's going to be out there. One of the things that people tend to forget about is analytics is super useful for marketing. It's also super useful for attackers. So leveraging some of that other tooling to try and find similarities between websites. Marketing, if you own uber.com, you're potentially consolidating that management, that marketing analytics piece, which means you're potentially going to have the same kinds of tokens. You're potentially going to have the same analytics ID across different sites. You can see here, builtwith.com is a really useful repo for this kind of information. You can see the kinds of Google tags that have been used and the kinds of analytics IDs that are used across different sites. And if they have the same ID, there's a high likelihood they're owned by the same organization. So again, allows you to collate all of those different websites that an organization might own. You saw just then, one of the key places that we find, and I'm sure a lot of people here are aware of, when you sign a certificate these days, that certificate signing process goes into what are called certificate transparency logs. Certificate transparency was a really big thing that was pushed pretty heavily by Google back in the day, still has a very big influence on certificate transparency logs, to the extent where if you try and visit a page that has a certificate that is signed, but that signature, that certificate doesn't exist within certificate transparency logs, Google trusts that certificate less, and so does Chrome. So certificate transparency logs are public. You can query them. crt.sh is a really great site. I believe it's by Komodo, where this is. You can search for this publicly. You can enter a top-level domain, uber.com, and you can then search for all kinds of subdomains, all kinds of other common names that that organization has signed. So again, building more and more assets that an attacker can potentially target. You can also do active scanning on this side of things. So if you want to, you can start to scan AWS's entire address space and pull out the common name that is attributed within those certificates to try and find the assets that are sitting on those IP addresses. A very common approach to finding assets, and you'll see when we talk about Census and Shodan, they do this process. Other kinds of tooling as well, so you don't have to use a manual approach for this. There is a lot of tooling available on GitHub as well to allow you to do this kind of digging. So feel free to play about and get stuck in. One of the other approaches for finding whether there's relationships between domains is internet spidering. So a spider will follow links on a website, and you can start to gather a whole bunch of domains that a single site links to. There's other things out there. SimilarWeb does this sort of thing as well, but also what you're looking at right here is Burp Suite, and on the left-hand side, you can see all of the list of spidered domains that we found just from uber.com's website. So we've just collated a whole bunch of information from a whole bunch of different open source repositories that are publicly accessible. We now want to go a little bit in the other direction. We want to start to drill deeper into those assets that we found. So we've got IP addresses, we've got host names. Let's start finding some of those subdomains that might be of use to us. And by us, I mean an attacker. One of the places for that is internet scan databases. I'm sure everybody on this call has heard of Census, have heard of Shodan. These are really useful. They scan the internet every week, I believe, and they'll scan for a subset of IP address, of port numbers, and you can use those websites to query for other assets that belong to whatever you're querying for. So we're searching for uber.com, and you can see that we found a bunch of additional IP addresses associated for uber.com. We've also started to find what ports are listening on those assets. ZoomEye is one of the newer solutions for this as well. Really useful. Gives you another database to query. And again, I believe this is Hacker. I can't remember exactly which one this is. Apologies. And then Shodan, which is the big one that that everybody knows about. This has been really useful. You've probably heard a lot of news about the iOS XE vulnerability that has been hitting the news recently. When you see some of the research that's come out off the back of that, a lot of the numbers associated with vulnerable systems within different geographies, a lot of those come from these internet scan engines. So people will do this querying for those kinds of vulnerable systems. As an attacker, it's a super useful indicator for where can I spray my exploit to try and get the most bang for my buck. One of the other solutions is DNS databases specifically. So we're talking history of your DNS records. Every time you change a DNS record, it's potentially been hoovered up by passive DNS databases. And one of those solutions is Security Trails, which is managed and run by Recorded Future. Again, really useful tool. You can see there we've entered Uber and we've started to see a whole bunch of other subdomains that Uber hosts. Rapid7, they've run the Sonar project, which is a huge corpus of data and information for trying to find those additional assets. And attackers have been using this for a while. These days, Rapid7 have locked that behind a paywall, or at least a request wall. So getting access to that data has become a little bit harder. We also have, I believe this is Shadow Server or Hacker Target, which is another similar tool for caching or searching for all of that historical DNS data. So there was a lot on subdomains and trying to find what subdomains you might be exploitable and attackable. URLs are also super useful. So because we found a bunch of subdomains, if there's websites running on those subdomains, we kind of want to know what's there. Get all URLs is a really useful tool. It's available in GitHub, and it, as you can see, it searches across Alien Vault's OTX, so Open Threat Exchange. It crawls the Wayback Machine, Common Crawl URL scan for any given domain, and it will give you a whole bunch of URLs that you can then start to use to find additional targets that belong to the organization. So these really are the tools that people are starting to use, or attackers are using, to map that attack surface and then drill deeper into what other kinds of subdomains are being used. Search engine dorking, this is the classic one, right? Like everybody's been doing this for years, where you can query for something, you've got the in URL dork there, well, the parameter within Google. I've searched for anything that contains uber.com in the URL, but then I want to exclude anything that is www.uber.com, and I can start to find those additional subdomains like help.uber.com. Public source code, not going to touch too long on this, but really useful. Uber has a whole bunch of different API endpoints it calls, and we can start to extract those too. GitHub subdomains.py is a useful tool for automating that whole process as well. So That's all using an informed approach, which is I'm trying to scrape information from places that I know the information exists. If I want to go down the old hammer approach, which is I just want to fire a whole bunch of different subdomains at a DNS resolver, so the name servers that you've configured for your organization, I can use sublister for that sort of attack. So this does very straightforward subdomain brute forcing, and you can get some pretty good results from it. One of the key things to bear in mind when you're doing that kind of brute forcing, though, is the kind of word list that attackers are using to find those subdomains. So when people say, the old approach of security through obscurity, which is, nobody will ever guess that subdomain. Well, if that word exists anywhere on your website, chances are somebody has scraped your website and built a word list from that website to then fire at your DNS resolvers. There's also public name lists, word lists out there as well. So best DNS word list.txt is the best DNS word list that you can use to do DNS brute forcing. We've had some pretty decent success with this in the past. So we've now gone from that breadth first search of finding all associated domains, organizations that are associated with your organizations and their subdomains, and then we've drilled down into additional subdomains that belong to those. So we're getting this really big tapestry of potential access points into the organization. What we want to do now is look even harder at those things. So we're going to start to find out what's running on those kinds of assets and whether there's any foothold for us to get from those assets we've identified. One of the first tools that people will run if they find an HTTP server is something like the old school Deerbuster. Deerbuster was the OWASP tool. GoBuster is a rewrite of that tool in Go, super hyper threaded. So really quick finding URL paths and URIs, and really good for enumerating all kinds of information once we've got a subdomain. Another tool is Kite Runner, and Kite Runner is a little bit more modern as well, and you can have some really good success if you point this at one of your systems of potentially finding files and folders. If we found a whole bunch of subdomains and assets, maybe we want to start finding credentials to see how we can log into those assets. Git leaks is a cool tool for that. It finds API keys, it finds tokens. One of the big things that you'll see in the news fairly frequently is that somebody hard coded their AWS access credentials into some code somewhere that was then pushed to a public Git repo. Attackers then find those, and there will be people out there. There are people out there who poll the GitHub API on a frequent basis to search for specific query terms, and as soon as they find one, they'll jump and pounce on those repos to try and exploit any hard-coded credentials that they're searching for. Trufflehog is probably the one that most people are familiar with when it comes to finding these kinds of secrets. Trufflehog is an open source tool, but it's also got a closed source cloud offering as well. So if we're starting to find those kinds of assets, I've mentioned already that perhaps we need those credentials, we need usernames and passwords to access those kinds of credentials. Well, one of the ways we can do that is if we're querying, we've already got DNS records for your organizations. If you check the TXT record, or even simpler, where does the mail server point to, we can work out what kind of environment or what kind of SaaS products you're using, specifically whether it's O365 or Google Workspaces or another type of mail provider. If we find somebody's running O365, one of the first steps we tend to take is start to enumerate user accounts for that organization. So you can do user enumeration and password brute forcing for this. O365 user enumerator is super useful. Excuse me. There we go. MSOL Spray is the Microsoft Online spraying tool. It says be very careful about not locking out accounts. If you spray this super frequently across all of your customer or all of your organization's accounts with 500 different types of password, you may end up locking out your account. If you do it low and slow, then potentially that will get under the lockout threshold. Microsoft started to be very clever when it comes to doing its lockouts, specifically looking for where the authentication request has come from and then matching that against previous login attempts. And if it looks fishy, then it tends to push you towards the multi-factor authentication approach. So that makes the login difficult, but it is still easy to try and enumerate email addresses associated with that organization. Internally, we have a tool that we've developed ourselves that we call Sprinkler. This is available on our premium plan for as a bolt-on service where we can run this against your O365 account and let you know when we found weak usernames and passwords. Finally, SaaS services. SaaS services are relatively easy to find, or they can be easy to find, mostly because the configuration documentation for SaaS services is public. So the likes of Okta, for example, you can browse all of the Okta documentation publicly, no problem, even if you're not a customer. One of the things you'll find is that usually you have to configure a subdomain associated with that SaaS service. Here is uber.okta.com, so we can immediately start to establish that Uber is using Okta somewhere in its authentication workflow. If we manage to compromise that, that's a huge win. So how easy is this? I've mentioned a whole bunch of things that attackers are doing, the tools they're kind of using, but actually you don't need to use individual tools to do this sort of thing. There are tools out there that automate the whole plethora of types of information that are being harvested. One of those tools is OWASP's Mass, part of the project Discovery. Really useful tool. It hooks into a whole bunch of APIs to pull that information into one central place. Additionally, people are doing this on Twitch. They're streaming it themselves. You can tune in, you can watch it, you can watch them do this OSINT gathering. And yeah, if they're able to do it as part of a Twitch stream, you can pretty much guarantee a dedicated or a concerted effort from a threat actor who's going to get financial incentive. It's going to be easy for them too. So what's the outcome of this? Well, really, we need to stay ahead of those attackers. Sounds like a lot. I know it does. But there are tools out there to help the defenders, not just the attackers. And as defenders, there's nothing stopping us using the same kind of techniques that attackers are using to find this attack surface. So one of the things that I tend to mention is that perfect is the enemy of good. There's usually quite a lot of hesitation from people when you have heard a talk like I just gave about all of the kinds of information that people can gather and where they can gather them from, that your solution has to be perfect. It doesn't. Start small and then build on that small foothold that you've built across your, like, to identify your attack surface and then build out from there. There's really no time like the present to start, especially with that iOS XE vulnerability that came out. Is a great way. It's a great, I suppose, use case or case study for why attack surface management is super useful. Let everyone do their jobs. So this tooling and the functionality that comes with attack surface management tooling doesn't need to be complicated. Everything you saw, like, you know, finding subdomains, doing the internet or doing the scanning of those assets to find open services, you can automate that whole process. There are tools out there that let you automate that, services that let you automate that. Intruder is one of those. One of the great things about our CloudBot tooling is that every time an asset gets spun up in your cloud accounts, we'll automatically include it in Intruder and kick off a vulnerability scan of it. What does that mean? It means you're not chasing your engineering team to find out what they've exposed to the internet. Your engineering team can focus on building, and you can have visibility of what they're exposing to the internet and making sure it's falling into your vulnerability management processes. Make your data work for you. So you probably saw a pop-up or one of the poll questions. If you're using cloud accounts, you already have this data. You have data associated with what's being exposed, where it's exposed. Make sure you use that data and make it work for you. You don't have to go into this completely blindfolded. And it's really worth mentioning that the goalposts are always moving. If you're in a high, I suppose, a rapidly developing and a rapidly evolving organization where your attack surface fluctuates, you're not going to be able to run this sort of process once and be done with it. Your attack surface will change, but more importantly, the threat landscape changes. New vulnerabilities are found, new types of technology are blown wide open by security researchers. So making sure you're staying on top of where those things are on a continuous basis is really useful. So some of the basic failings that we see at Intruder, people putting things on the internet that they shouldn't be on the internet, people not monitoring and not following that continuous approach. We see so many people tell us they just want that one-off scan, but as you've already seen, the attack surface does change and the threat landscape changes. So really make sure you stay on top of that monitoring. And then finally, the last piece was not seeing the big picture. So yes, it's very easy to run down the rabbit hole of just looking for subdomains, but actually, what does that mean across the entire organization? So don't just focus on subdomains. Start to dig into what services are running on those assets. How much of an impact do they have on your organization? Are they critical assets? Our view, the tool that we have internally within your Intruder portal, if you're a customer or a trial user, is Network View, and that's a really great place to start to get a view on what your attack surface looks like from the point of view of an attacker, as well as giving you the flexibility to drill down into the type of technology that is exposed to the internet. So there's the 4 top tips. You don't have to wait. You could aim for perfect, but don't let that prevent you from starting right now. Empower your users to build securely. Let them focus on their jobs and use tooling that allows you to automate that attack surface discovery piece. Work with the data you've got, or rather make it do the heavy lifting and work for you. And then make sure you make it continuous. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening to me ramble on for a little bit about attack surface discovery. It's one of those things that is super dear to my heart and I know is incredibly important. My background in red teaming, there wasn't a red team that I did where I didn't hear the phrase, "Oh, we didn't know that was exposed to the internet and we weren't monitoring that part of our network." So it is a difficult task. It can be, it seems like a daunting task, but there is help out there. And one of those people or organizations that's there to help you is Intruder. So without much more of a sales pitch, I'm going to hand you over to Joe, who's going to do a bit of a demo for what this looks like in Portal.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much, Andy. Some lots of interesting, insightful stuff there, and also some great tips. So thank you. I'm just going to take you guys through a bit of a demo of how Intruder works and how we can actually help you manage your attack surface and make that process nice and easy. So we're going to start off nice and easy on the dashboard. So this is where you can get an overview. Once you've been using the platform for a little bit, you've run some scans, you can get a bit of an overview of your current threat level and cyber hygiene score. So things like any issues that are present on your targets, as well as your longer term overview of how you've been remediating your issues and things like that have been present on your targets. One of the key things that Andy mentioned was CloudBot, and that helps you manage your cloud assets and anything new that might have spun up in them environments. So if you go to your targets tab and then go to the cloud accounts view, you can click into a specific cloud account. And up on the top right, you'll see a settings icon. Within there, there's 3 options. Your first one is to auto add targets. So this is an awesome feature that means that when we run a CloudBot sync, which runs every 2 hours, we will pull in any new assets that have been discovered since the previous scan. So it is quite often the case that an organization will have some cloud assets that they're spun up for some development purposes, and then they might potentially say, oh, it's 5 o'clock, it's the end of the day, maybe forget to spin them down, and they'll still be running, the attack surface is still present on those targets, and you might not be aware of them without this. So this enables you to make sure that that runs continuously, and you get an overview and visibility of that on your end as well. We also have that second option, which I mentioned, which is auto scan targets. So that enables not just the visibility, but also that scanning part of it as well. So the targets will be brought in and automatically scanned as soon as they're brought in. So any issues that are present on these new assets that are part of your infrastructure can also be, shown to you and made very clear, and you're made aware of them. So they're two things that I highly recommend if you're an Intruder customer currently, or if you're looking to become one, enabling and makes that process nice and easy. You've also got that final option there, which is just to bring across the tag as well. Once you've imported these targets and you've run a few scans, which you can do from the scans page here by clicking off in the top right-hand side, or scheduling one on the right tab over here on the right here, you will then generate a list of issues that are present on these targets. So as part of our Pro plan and our Essential plan, you can get some issues that have been detected by the scanning engine, and you'll see them listed here. So we also make the whole process as simple as possible to show you anything that might be relevant to your attack surface by highlighting those issues with this highlighting here. So this mentions attack surface issues there on that particular target. You can then view how that might impact you or affect you with the description there, and then how you'd remediate it in the description on the right, as well as some further information about that underneath there as well. And in addition to that, for those customers on our two high-level plans, Premium and Vanguard, there are advisories that are also created and found by the security team. So things like bug hunting, manual investigation, there's some examples here you can see. So they are also things that can infect or impact your attack surface. And you can also view what they've written about that particular issue in the description there, and how to remediate it by requesting a retest with this button on the right-hand side. So again, another way of making it nice and simple. You detect it, you run a retest scan, it's resolved, and it's as quick and efficient as possible. My next little thing I wanted to highlight was on the network page. So that's another thing Andy mentioned in his tips section. Any targets that you add to your portal, so that could be an IP range, could be domain, it could be a cloud asset, we will run a network scan against those targets. This network scan will give you the visibility of the open ports that are running on those particular targets. So for example, I can see that the port 80 is open on this target, and if I click into that, I can see a screenshot of that particular asset, which helps you identify what exactly it is that is running on that port. You can also see underneath this here, the specific product that is running on that service, and that's super useful information to know, especially in the context of this new Cisco vulnerability that's come out. And you can also highlight on the left-hand side under the filtering section here, I could say I'm interested in anything that's running Apache. You can then view those there. So if perhaps you'd have a number of assets that have that Cisco iOS version, when you can tick that box there, and it will give you a list of them, where to focus your efforts. And naturally, you want to be aware of these things as soon as you potentially can. And you can do that with the help of some of our integrations. So we've got Slack and Teams in our alerting side of things here. We can also send you some email notifications as well. And both of those are super useful ways of being aware of things as soon as you possibly can. And that is it from me. Back to Courtney.
Thanks so much, Joe and Andy, for such a thorough walkthrough on some basic principles around attack surface management. We're going to head into the Q&A. We've only got a couple of minutes. We don't want to keep everybody forever. So why don't I kick off with one of the questions that came through, and anybody else who has any questions, pop them into the box now. This is your chance to ask the experts. Right. So first question, when doing an asset inventory, where should I look first? Where am I most likely to find stuff exposed to the internet that shouldn't be?
Should I take that one?
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. So I don't think there's going to be one answer that is going to be right for everybody for this one. However, thinking about, I suppose, the type of organization that you are, if you are predominantly a cloud-based organization, so from the looks of the polls that went out, we're seeing about a 50-50% between mostly cloud-based and hybrid. So the cloud-based side of things is really good. It already has a repository of the types of assets that exist within those accounts, and as a result are potentially exposed to the internet. You can hook them up to Intruder if you'd like to get greater visibility on that, or an easier or more simple to understand view on what that attack surface looks like. On the hybrid and the on-prem side of things, there are a bunch of different tools, or I suppose repositories, of where this type of information is usually kept. If you're a domain-based, and by domain I mean Windows domain-based organization, there's Active Directory. Active Directory can help you there. If you use any kind of configuration management for your endpoints, then you can start to look at things like Intune for Windows, Kanji, or Jamf for your Mac environments. If you're running internal workloads, like you're using hypervisors such as VMware, take a look at VMware, and potentially also take a look across your firewalls. So firewall rule sets for what's allowed to reach out to the internet and come into your organization are also good places to check. Really, it depends entirely on the makeup of the organization for where they're going to find that kind of data. But start to think of what's installed on your assets, like what calls back to a central location, and can you leverage any of that to try and build at least some indicative knowledge base for what's running within your environment. Hopefully that helps.
Awesome. Thanks, Andy. We've only got about 2 minutes left, so I think the rest of the questions we'll answer on the blog. But Andy, if you wanted to give a quick briefer on just how bad the Cisco IS vuln was just in the last 2 minutes here.
Yeah, I mean, 2 minutes for this. So the Cisco iOS vulnerability hit the news and hit the headlines over the last couple of days. It's one of those vulnerabilities that shouldn't really be a vulnerability, and the reason it shouldn't be a vulnerability is because it's your Cisco iOS, so the HTTP web management console for your Cisco networking devices. Now, realistically, the ideal is that they aren't connected or they aren't accessible from the internet at all. They're blocked behind access control lists and network level firewall rules to prevent access to those endpoints. But actually using the tooling that we saw previously, like Census and Shodan, you can run a query. If you just search for Cisco iOS in Shodan, you can see there's about 40,000 assets exposed to the internet with that banner. And if you use Census, you can actually drill down into iOS-XE-web UI, and you can see there's about 33,000 assets exposed to the internet. So even though it's it's something that realistically shouldn't be exposed to the internet, there are people who have this exposed to the internet. And we've been chatting about this internally. One of the guys in our team is an ex-sysadmin, and he remembers just how difficult it is to actually disable that remote admin console on Cisco devices. So not really a wonder that this is being widely exploited in the wild. It does allow remote code execution. It does allow people to upload a backdoor that they can then come back to and run future commands on. And yeah, if at Intruder, we would do daily scanning of every port against all of the assets you have in Intruder. So with that network view, you'd be able to very quickly find that asset or those assets running Cisco iOS and potentially introduce that firewall ruling before an exploit or a check comes out for that vulnerability. So it's just like a nice little use case for how network view can help you be more proactive in your vulnerability management and your attack surface management. That's it from me.
Awesome. We just released a blog talking about this very thing, so you can see the link in the chat, or you can just head over to the website and look at some of the blog articles we have on recent vulns. Otherwise, thanks so much, Andy and Joe, and for everybody else who joined us today. If we didn't get to your question, we'll follow up with you directly. Also, anybody who registered is going to receive a recording of the webinar that you can share with your team or any friends and family who might be interested. Remember, you can always get in touch with us via the chat box on the website or in the portal. And if you're new to Intruder and interested in taking the platform for a spin yourself, head over to the website and sign up for a free trial. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.